Okay, wow, what a wonderful panelists, and thank you all for your reflections on universities and historical injustices. So we have time for questions. So I invite you all to please ask.
I'm curious what was said at the football game when the descendants of the enslaved were introduced.
I was actually standing on the field and could not hear. So I heard from my students when I went back to class that Monday, and they were conflicted, I will say, because Mrs. Martin was actually introduced as a descendant of Sharper and Caroline, who had been enslaved on the Fort Hill plantation. And because it's a very festive occasion, some of my students felt that it was inappropriate for her to have been introduced that way without more context. So Mrs. Martin, on the other hand, was thrilled and had no problem at all and was actually quite proud to have that kind of recognition and to hear her ancestors' names proclaimed before this audience. I mean, it's at a football game, you've got probably about 80,000 people in the stadium. And so what I try to do is if the community partners that I'm working with are comfortable with the recognition or the experience that the university is offering, then I don't worry about what other people think. Mrs. Martin was happy. Her family was happy. She brought her family. Before she came down on the field, she was the special guest in the president's box. So I think for her, it was a moment when the history came full circle, and she was just fine with that. So it's kind of difficult sometimes when I wouldn't do something, but if the descendant wants to do something, then I'm going to respect that choice. So, the response was fabulous. People were cheering, and
So a Clemson football game looked like an Auburn football game. Folk in the crowd.
yeah, it just, I mean, I have footage of it, and people knew what was happening, and she got such a warm welcome, and they just wrapped their arms around her. Everybody was treating her like a queen that night, all the people, and she's very charming. She's 93 now. She was 90, I think, that year. Lucid, so everywhere she went, she had a tiger paw sweater on, the sparkling purple hat. So for her, it was an honor. And at 90 years old, if she thought that was an honor, I wasn't going to argue with her, frankly.
I have a question actually for Christine and Rose. I was, very much struck by, your presentation and all your presentations. And you mentioned that there's actually more archival and sort of data transparency on Canada. And, but I also wonder from the sort of collaborations of the powerful, right? So what sort of historical sort of stories and narratives of what was going on between enactors, right, of these boarding schools, of settler colonialism, of these genocidal practices between Canadian, privileged Canadians and privileged folks in the US, right? So, because these things were happening, I mean, of course, the borders as we know it today don't necessarily coincide, but it sort of strikes me that there are these conversations among the privileged to share knowledge about these kinds of settler colonial and genocidal and assimilative school practices. So anyway, yeah.
Yeah, we didn't get to get into that history as much. We shortened our presentation. But General Pratt, Henry Pratt, was the founder of the Carlisle Indian boarding school, and that was the first federal off-reservation boarding school here in the U.S. And he actually had, as his role in the Army, he had a group of prisoners of war at Fort Marion down in Florida, and they were Apache. And he basically taught them to speak English, and he gave them extra privileges as they became more civilized, and then that's how he took his idea to the government and said, I would like to open this school because these Indians are capable of being civilized, and he wrote a book called The Red Man's Moses. He felt that it was actually more compassionate, and that's why you saw the slide with kill the Indian, save the man, because previously, in order to make way for westward expansion, the policy was to just kill Indians. And around the time that the Carlisle School was opened, there was also a campaign to kill the buffalo. So there was a lot of things going on, basically all around land. And so yes, so when he formed Carlisle, it was still an experiment, and he wanted to prove that it worked, so he created a lot of propaganda. If you Google boarding schools or Indian boarding schools, the majority of the pictures that you see, a lot of before and after pictures, are from Carlisle. A lot of the other schools didn't have that same history of photography because Pratt actually hired somebody to come in and take these before and after photos to prove that his experiment was working. So then he befriended Sheldon Jackson, who was a Presbyterian missionary, and he took the boarding schools up into Alaska, even before it was a state. Where it was still just a territory. And we see that the boarding school system or residential school system not only went into Canada, but also Australia and New Zealand. And most notably, all of those countries have apologized or entered some form of reparations or reconciliation, except the US.
Can I add something?
Oh, yes.
One of the things, your presentation was fabulous, by the way. I think it's really important to understand that these boarding schools gave Native children half an education. You know, they were called industrial boarding schools, and what that meant was Native children were being taught the skills that would give them just enough education in order to be an exploitable second class. Mm. Girls learned to cook and bake bread and wash floors and take care of children. Boys learned to pitch hay and dig ditches, and so they were going to be somebody's indentured servant, basically. That was the intent, in my opinion.
Yeah. And that's confirmed in the 1924 Miriam report, in which the government or Congress, this report to Congress outlines that a lot of these students aren't receiving a quality education. My great-grandfather, when he went to Carlisle, he was 20 years old, and he had a third-grade education level.
There's a hand here, yeah.
So I know that mass incarceration and prison industrial complex are being talked about as extensions of slavery historically, and I'm wondering if there's any people at Northwestern or at Clemson or at St. Cloud or perhaps at University of Chicago who are looking at the specific school's current ties to prison labor?
Mm-hmm.
There?
Yeah, the food served at the University of Chicago's dormitories, the actual dining halls, comes from a company named Armac, which also supplies food to prisons.
Airmark.
Airmark.
Right, supplies prisons. And the most brilliant part, the president of Airmark is a trustee at the University of Chicago.
Go figure.
So he is actually having the university purchase his saying that supports the whole. So yeah, they're in there. They're tight.
So I think at Clemson, I'm still trying to document this. One of my students, what seems to have happened is that initially convict laborers were working on site because they were building, the institution. So Clemson has now fanned out all across the state. So I have heard secondhand that Clemson is still using convict labor to this day. And the latest evidence I had, one of my students saw one of the convict laborers in a space that she was in. And I have seen some of the correspondence between the university and the state penitentiary system regarding use of convict labor. So it's very low key, and it's been moved off-site, but we also use Airmark, and we are trying to determine what other contracts we have with businesses that are also tied up with the prison and, the prison system at this point. We haven't ferreted it all out, but definitely Airmark is one of the ones.
Harvard's endowment was in
Could you speak up?
Harvard's endowment, which is, I think Harvard's the second biggest nonprofit in the world, I believe, after the Vatican, I think. Its endowment is invested in the prison industrial complex, and so their students are organizing now to divest.
We do too, by the way. Lots of it all over the place.
Okay. I think it's fairly common, but because it's through these contracts that it's not always evident.
It's very low key here.
Yeah, very low key. But I think in 13th, the documentary, there's if I'm remembering correctly, at some point, there's a screen where all of these companies that are tied in with the prison system pop up on the screen. And many of those companies have contracts with universities all across the nation.
Patty, did you have something you want to add?
No, I'm so new at Northwestern, I'm still trying to find where the restrooms are, so I don't know what, I have no knowledge about that, but I just Googled it, because it's a really great question, and I want to know.
Any other questions? Oh, yes.
Thank you everyone so much for your presentations. It's been really wonderful to hear. I'm someone that's trying to write a dissertation on writings by enslaved people in the Caribbean, so it's really moving to hear about all of the work that's going on at universities and beyond. I wanted to ask about, I noticed kind of a tension or set of conversations in a lot of folks' presentations about the challenges of, kind of institutional or academic knowledge and sort of this conferral of authority and kind of academic knowledge, and then, people's stories and anecdotes and things that maybe don't easily show up in documents, and so, and also maybe this tension between the law and a kind of maybe more sense of natural law or other kinds of desires for reparations. So just wondering if folks might talk about some of those tensions, documents, oral history, and do you think, for example, the oral histories could maybe change and shape differently the ways that people in academia do their work?
Actually, the last dissertation that I directed at the University of Wisconsin-Madison was by a young woman who was looking at water quality on the Bad River Reservation. And she interviewed elders and also developed a reciprocal relationship and brought some skills and resources that she had to the community, which was really great. But in the course of her research, she really came to believe what I think, Rose, you mentioned, that there are people who have fancy letters after their names and, degrees, but in the community, there are people who have deep knowledge that needs to be acknowledged, and it's every bit as important as the kind of academic degrees that we have. It's a different kind of deep indigenous knowledge. And so what my student did, she did humanities students often will write books, but she came out of an environmental science tradition, and they basically write 3 journal articles and publish those together. She published her middle article with that elder, and it wasn't a matter of, sitting and saying, what do you think? It was the elder published her work and you see her words in a different kind of script. She's in italics. And my graduate student was in Times New Roman. And so you could see the different voices. And when she presented a new concept, there was the Western orientation, and then there was the oral stories, the creation stories, the indigenous knowledge, the traditional ecological knowledge from this elder. And I don't know whether that's been done before. I wouldn't be surprised if it was done somewhere before, but it was initially a struggle to get that kind of dissertation through a process. That's just not, you don't co-publish parts of your dissertation. But luckily, Jesse had a really, I think, visionary committee who was willing to accept that, and I'm excited to see it published.
I'd like to speak to that as well. I think, so the coalition, we work cross-sector as well as cross-cultural. So I really think you're onto something there, and it goes beyond just academia. So some of the work that we do involves legal systems, and often finding that these other paradigms, which are colonial-based worldviews, don't necessarily coincide with what we feel in indigenous communities would equal justice, or even the term reparations and redress, and that's all very colonial mindset and framework. So yeah, there is a tension. As we look at what we want in our communities for healing, we have a slide, but we had to go very condensed. But we have a slide, Dr. Maria Yellowhorse-Braveheart talks about healing, the process of healing historical trauma. And it begins with confronting it, and then you understand it, and then eventually you can heal and transcend it. So depending on the context, if you're talking about in academia doing the research, is that part of the confronting it? Is that part of the understanding it? As well as in the legal systems, we want the U.S. to acknowledge the boarding schools that they ran. We want the churches to acknowledge. So really, we are looking for something that is truly holistic, that transcends all of these different paradigms and mindsets. And it's not just academia. It's not just the legal system. It's truly something more human than any of those systems can deliver.
And I think for me, I'll just say one thing, like for the convict labor generation, the documents that I have are court records, right? They're records from the penitentiary. We have been releasing some of those records, but I've been very reluctant to put them on a website in a database because it's all I have. So we're starting, the first thing that people will see are names and birthplaces, and that's all. So we're asking people to help us create a story so that these individuals are not reduced to a certain number of years or months in the state penitentiary working on Clemson College's convict crew. But I can't do that without the community's help. And I want to privilege that part of the narrative and make the convict history secondary. So until we have those stories, Robert Shaw will be the first story we'll probably write because his family is local. And I think the same for Mrs. Martin. If all I had was an inventory from the plantation and just had Sharper, Caroline, and Matilda, she has come forward and passed on to us stories that have been passed down for generations in her family So I'm able to tell a very different story than just trying to piece together a story from a primary document. And so for me, they're both different types of research, and I try not to privilege one over the other, but say I can't do this without all of the above. The primary documents are important, but those voices from the community for me are maybe more important. And so I think putting all of those things together and doing it in a really collaborative way where people feel like when we come to the table, we really are partners trying to recover this history and not this top-down academic approach is where I'm most comfortable and what I'm really trying to create. And it's hard to create, but I'm really trying to do that and to welcome as many people who want to be a part of the project as I can handle.
If I can just jump on that, and offering evidence in a way that doesn't make it appear that we need a Western colonial sort of orientation to validate these oral stories. That's the really tricky, that's the real tricky part, I think.
I agree.
At least it has been for me.
I agree.
Yeah, question.
Yeah, I was just wondering if there were any examples of universities and or institutions working together to create some kind of initiatives to recognize these stories and these histories?
There's a consortium called University Studying Slavery that came out of the University of Virginia. I think there are about 45 universities that are part of that now. The most recent development with the consortium is to reach out to historically Black colleges and universities and pull them into a coalition. So we get together twice a year to talk about the projects on our campuses and to share resources. So I have found being a part of that coalition has really helped me to understand how different universities are approaching the history, to get ideas for how Clemson can do our work better, and also for leverage, because I think sometimes if, the University of South Carolina often says it follows our lead, so when we get something done, they're able to go back to their trustees and say, we need to do this. So I think it's helped us all to keep, kind of all of us moving our projects forward. Instead of working in isolation.
I think we could speak to, I know we mentioned a little bit the collaboration that we're working on with the University of Minnesota right now in this survey, and that's just one project, but I think in that case, we as a small nonprofit, we don't have the resources to put on a giant quantitative study like that, and so I think what has been really great for us in terms of the partnership was that the scholars that we've worked with from the University of Minnesota have given us and Sandy really power over what kind of the questions that are in the survey and really shaping the content, but the resources when it comes to putting the survey online and doing the analysis is really where they've been able to come in and help. And I think, we're in process right now, but I think that's another great example of a partnership where, we both are bringing resources to the table to put together a project that neither of us could really do on our own.
I think the other thing with Call My Name, I just remember with my 3 community partners, I've been able to make the resources of the university available to them, so they'll come with specific projects, and it's no cost at all. Whatever they need, we have a client-based program, we have a Pearce Center for Communications, we are helping one of the partners with a holiday program and, just connecting them, and it's all at no cost. So we have grants that we can use to cover the cost of some of their needs, but that was something I've been working on for quite a long time, to just get to the place where they are actually able to tap into the enormous resources of Clemson University to do their local work on their terms. And I think it's really important for us to ascertain what they need and then figure out how to provide that.
And we've started with hyper-local collaborations with community groups, the Chicago American Indian Community Collaborative, CAKE, and the American Indian Association of Illinois, to try to, and we've been meeting over the past year to look at mutual aspirations. But one of the things that we hear from Native students at all the, and these include academic institutions, including the University of Chicago and University of Illinois at Chicago. One of the things that we hear is that students feel invisible. When you live in a state that has no federally recognized tribes, and in a city where, 90% of the BIA budget goes to reservation-based programs and nations. Urban Indians get virtually nothing. So our problems are very different than reservation problems, and these are challenges that I'm just beginning to learn about. But yeah, collaboration is absolutely essential.
All right, well, thank you all so much. Thank you, panelists and speakers.